An atheist millionaire humiliated a little beggar who was reading the Bible on the street. "Go get a job, God doesn't fill stomachs," he said in front of everyone. But 2 hours later, what happened was shocking. Richard Sterling stood at the top of his gleaming skyscraper, surveying the Manhattan skyline as if it were his personal kingdom. In many ways it was. As the CEO of Sterling Real Estate Development, he had transformed the city's landscape with his ambitious projects, each tower rising higher than the last, each deal more lucrative than its predecessor. His newest acquisition would be announced today, a historic neighborhood he planned to transform into luxury condominiums. The morning sun reflected off the glass and steel monuments to his success, but Richard barely noticed its beauty anymore. At 55, he had everything money could buy: a penthouse overlooking Central Park, a fleet of luxury cars, a mansion in the Hamptons, and more wealth than he could spend in 3 lifetimes. His wife, Victoria, was the perfect corporate spouse, elegant, sophisticated, and always camera-ready for charity galas and business functions. Their son, Marcus, was being groomed to take over the empire one day, though Richard had no intention of stepping down anytime soon. "Mr. Sterling," his assistant's voice crackled through the intercom, "the board is waiting in the conference room." Richard straightened his custom-made Italian tie and smoothed back his silver hair. The morning's meeting would finalize his latest project, adding another billion to his net worth. He had outmaneuvered every competitor, silenced every opposition, and now victory was at hand. As he strode through the corridors of his empire, employees scattered like leaves in the wind. Some offered nervous smiles, others averted their eyes completely. Richard preferred it this way. Fear was more reliable than respect, and loyalty could always be bought for the right price. He had learned these lessons early in his career, and they had served him well. The boardroom fell silent as he entered. 12 men and women in expensive suits sat around a mahogany table, their laptops open, their expressions carefully neutral. Richard didn't bother with pleasantries. "Let's make this quick," he announced, taking his seat at the head of the table. "I have a groundbreaking ceremony at 11. The presentation began, and Richard's mind wandered to his upcoming victory speech. He had already selected the perfect spot for his new tower, right where that annoying little church currently stood. The congregation had refused his generous offer to relocate, clinging to their belief that the historic building held some special significance. Richard scoffed at their sentimentality. Progress couldn't be stopped by fairy tales and superstition. The meeting concluded exactly as he had planned. Papers were signed, hands were shaken, and another piece of New York City fell under his control. Richard gathered his things, ready to head to his next conquest. "Sir," his assistant intercepted him at the door, "your wife called. She wanted to remind you about dinner tonight. It's your anniversary." Richard waved dismissively. "Send her some flowers. I'll be working late." He stepped into his private elevator, checking his watch. The groundbreaking ceremony would be starting soon, and he wanted to savor the moment when that little church's congregation realized their prayers had gone unanswered. As the elevator descended, Richard reflected on how far he'd come from his humble beginnings. He had built all this himself, through sheer determination and ruthless efficiency. God hadn't helped him. Hard work and cunning had. The elevator, doors opened to the lobby, and Richard stepped out into his kingdom of glass and steel. He nodded curtly to the security guards and pushed through the revolving doors onto the busy street. His driver was waiting with the car, but Richard decided to walk the few blocks to the ceremony site. He wanted to approach it like a conquering emperor surveying his newest acquisition. As he walked, the crowds parted before him, recognizing the man whose name adorned half the buildings in the financial district. Richard barely noticed them anymore. They were all just obstacles in his path to greater success. But then, something unusual caught his eye. Something that would change the course of his perfectly ordered life forever. Sitting on the steps of the very church he planned to demolish was a small girl no more than 7 years old. Her clothes were worn and patched, her feet bare despite the autumn chill. But what caught Richard's attention was the large, leather-bound book in her lap. She sat there reading quietly, seemingly oblivious to the bustle of New York City around her. Richard wouldn't have given her a second glance normally, but something about the scene irritated him. Here he was, about to transform this neighborhood into something magnificent, and this child was the perfect example of why change was needed. The area had become a haven for vagrants and dreaming fools who contributed nothing to society's progress. He stopped in front of her, casting a shadow across her book. The girl looked up, and Richard was struck by her eyes. They seemed too old for her young face, too knowing. She didn't shrink away from his imposing presence as most children did. "Shouldn't you be in school?" he asked, his voice sharp with disapproval. The girl smiled, a gentle expression that somehow made Richard even more uncomfortable. "I'm learning right here, sir," she replied, holding up her book. Richard recognized it as a Bible. He couldn't help but laugh. "A Bible? That won't feed you or put a roof over your head. This building," he gestured to the church behind her, "will be gone in a month. Progress doesn't wait for fairy tales." The girl's smile didn't waver. "Money can buy many things, Mr. Sterling, but not what truly matters. In 2 hours, everything you have will be taken away." Richard felt a chill run down his spine, not from her words, but from the calm certainty with which she spoke them. How did she know his name? But he quickly dismissed the feeling. He was Richard Sterling, and he hadn't built his empire by listening to supernatural nonsense. "Listen, child," he said condescendingly. "I've spent my life building something real, something you can see and touch. Your prayers won't stop the wrecking balls. If you want to make something of yourself, put down that book and learn about the real world." The girl closed her Bible and stood up, her movements deliberate and graceful. "The real world is bigger than your towers, Mr. Sterling. When everything is gone, remember this moment. Remember that faith can build bridges where money builds walls." Something about her words unsettled him deeply, but Richard pushed the feeling aside. He had more important things to do than argue with a child. He checked his watch. The groundbreaking ceremony would begin in 20 minutes. As he walked away, he heard her voice one last time. 2 hours, Mr. Sterling. God gives everyone a chance to change." Richard straightened his jacket and quickened his pace. The morning sun had disappeared behind gathering clouds, and a cool wind whipped between the buildings. He arrived at the ceremony site, where a crowd had already gathered. Reporters, city officials, his business partners and protesters held back by security barriers. He took his place at the podium, surveying the crowd with the confidence of a man who had never known failure. The cameras flashed, and Richard began his carefully prepared speech about progress and urban renewal. But as he spoke, he couldn't shake the memory of the girl's eyes or her strange prophecy. 2 hours, she had said. Richard glanced at his watch again, pushing away an inexplicable sense of unease. He was being ridiculous. He had built his empire on concrete and steel, not supernatural warnings from mysterious children. Yet even as he continued his speech, somewhere in the back of his mind, a clock began to tick. The groundbreaking ceremony continued under increasingly dark skies. Richard was just wrapping up his speech when the first drops of rain began to fall. He noticed several board members checking their phones with concerned expressions, but he pressed on, describing his vision for the luxury complex that would replace the old church. "This development will bring new life to a stagnant neighborhood," he proclaimed, gripping the podium as thunder rumbled in the distance. "The future belongs to those bold enough to seize it." Just then, his own phone began vibrating insistently in his pocket. Richard ignored it at first, but it kept buzzing again and again. Finally, during a round of polite applause, he discreetly checked the screen. 17 missed calls from his office, his wife, and his son. Something was wrong. He gestured for his assistant to take over and stepped away from the podium, dialing his office first. His secretary answered on the first ring, her voice trembling. "Mr. Sterling, thank God. The systems, everything's down. All our servers. Crashed simultaneously. We can't access any files, any accounts. The tech team says it's like everything just vanished." Richard's throat tightened. "Call our IT security contractors. Whatever it costs, get it fixed." "Sir, they're not responding. And there's more, the press is calling. Someone leaked documents about the church property acquisition. The Historical Society is filing an emergency injunction. The mayor's office is distancing themselves from the project. The rain was falling harder now, soaking through his expensive suit. Richard looked at his watch. Exactly 1 hour had passed since his encounter with the girl. He pushed the thought away and dialed his son. "Dad," Marcus's voice was tight with panic. "You need to get back to the office right now. The board is calling an emergency meeting. Our stock is in freefall." "What? Why?" Someone posted proof that the environmental impact studies for the church development were falsified. "Our biggest investors are pulling out. The SEC is..." Richard ended the call and tried to think. This was a coordinated attack. It had to be. But who had the power to orchestrate something on this scale? He scrolled through his contacts, looking for allies he could call, favors he could collect. His finger hovered over Victoria's number, but before he could dial, a new message appeared. It was from his wife, but instead of text, it contained only a video file. With shaking fingers, Richard pressed play. The footage showed Victoria in their penthouse, speaking directly to the camera. "I'm sorry it had to be this way, Richard," she began, her voice steady, "but you left me no choice. For 30 years I've watched you destroy everything and everyone in your path. You've forgotten what it means to be human. Maybe losing everything will remind you." The video ended. Richard stared at the dark screen, raindrops splattering against it. Around him, the ceremony was breaking up in confusion as news of the growing scandal spread through the crowd. Reporters who moments ago had been docilely recording his speech now turned to him with hungry expressions, shouting questions about fraud and corruption. His security team rushed to surround him, hustling him toward his waiting car. As they pushed through the crowd, Richard caught a glimpse of the church steps where he'd met the girl. She was gone, but her words echoed in his mind. "Money can buy many things, Mr. Sterling, but not what truly matters." Inside the car, Richard tried to make sense of what was happening. In less than an hour, the foundations of his empire had begun to crack. But he was Richard Sterling. He had survived setbacks before. He would find who was responsible, and they would pay dearly for crossing him. "Take me to the office," he ordered his driver. "Now!" As the car pulled away from the curb, Richard's phone lit up with another message. This one was from an unknown number, containing just 4 words. "1 more hour remains." The car wound through the rain-slicked streets of Manhattan, passing the gleaming towers that bore his name. Richard stared up at them, remembering how he'd stood atop his building that morning, feeling like a god. Now those same buildings seemed to loom over him like judges, waiting to deliver their verdict. The Sterling Building's lobby was in chaos when Richard arrived. Security guards struggled to hold back a growing crowd of reporters and protesters. The rain had driven them inside, and their angry voices echoed off the marble walls. Richard ignored them all, striding toward his private elevator. But when he pressed his thumb to the biometric scanner, the panel remained dark. "Your access has been revoked, Mr. Sterling," a voice said behind him. It was James Chen, head of building security, a man who had worked for Richard for 20 years. "The board's orders." "The board?" Richard turned, incredulous. "I own this building." "Not anymore, sir. Ownership was transferred an hour ago. Your son Marcus executed some kind of pre-arranged contingency protocol. All your codes and permissions have been cancelled." Richard's mind reeled. Marcus had always been ambitious, but this level of betrayal was inconceivable. He pulled out his phone to call his lawyers, only to find that his service had been cut off. One by one, every tool and advantage he had relied on was being stripped away. Through the lobby's glass walls, he could see more news vans arriving. The story was spreading. Richard Sterling, the untouchable titan of real estate, was falling. He thought of his morning walk across these same streets, how the crowds had parted before him in fear and respect. Now they gathered to witness his downfall. A security guard approached hesitantly. "Sir, the board is asking you to leave the premises." Richard straightened his spine, summoning every ounce of the authority he'd wielded for decades. "I built this company. You can't just..." "Dad." Marcus emerged from the crowd, impeccable in his tailored suit. At 32, He was the spitting image of Richard in his younger days, ambitious, ruthless, and now victorious. Behind him stood Victoria, Richard's wife of 30 years, her expression a mixture of sadness and resolution. "It's over," Marcus said quietly. "We've transferred everything, the companies, the properties, the accounts. The board has already approved the leadership change. You taught me to seize opportunities, remember? To never let sentiment stand in the way of progress." Richard stared at his son, seeing his own teachings turned against him. He looked at Victoria, searching for any hint of the love they'd once shared. "Why?" "Because you were going to destroy that church," she replied. "The same church where we were married, where Marcus was christened, where my parents' funeral was held. You knew what it meant to me, to this community, but you didn't care. You never care about anything but money and power." "The girl," Richard whispered. "Did you—" Victoria frowned. "What girl?" But Richard was already turning away, pushing through the revolving doors into the rain. The prophecy was coming true, piece by piece. Everything he had built, everything he had believed in, was crumbling around him. He checked his watch. 30 minutes remained until the 2 hours were complete. Without access to his cars or drivers, Richard found himself walking through the streets he had once ruled. The rain had become a downpour, and his Italian leather shoes squelched with every step. People hurried past under umbrellas, no longer recognizing the drenched man who had lost his kingdom. His feet carried him back toward the church, drawn by some force he couldn't explain. The construction equipment stood silent in the rain, the ceremonial groundbreaking now a mockery of his hubris. The protesters had dispersed, leaving only empty signs declaring, "Save our heritage and community, not profit." Richard climbed the church steps, seeking shelter from the rain. Water dripped from his silver hair, his designer suit ruined. He sank down on the same spot where the girl had sat that morning, her impossible prophecy still ringing in his ears. The church door creaked open behind him. Richard turned, half expecting to see the mysterious child. Instead, an elderly priest stood there, regarding him with gentle eyes. "Perhaps you'd like to come in out of the rain, Mr. Sterling." Richard laughed bitterly. "Come to gloat, Father. Your prayers worked after all. The great Richard Sterling has lost everything." The priest smiled. "Lost everything? Or gained an opportunity to find what truly matters?" As if in answer, Richard's watch chimed softly. 2 hours had passed. The church interior was dim and quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos of Richard's morning. Stained glass windows cast colored shadows across worn wooden pews, and the scent of old wood and candle wax filled the air. The priest, who introduced himself as Father Thomas, led Richard to a small office off the main sanctuary. "Tea?" the priest offered, gesturing to a worn armchair beside a small electric heater. "You look like you could use something warm." Richard sank into the chair, his wet clothes leaving dark patches on the faded upholstery. Just hours ago, he would have sneered at the shabby furniture and peeling paint. Now the simple warmth of the heater felt like an undeserved luxury. "Why are you helping me?" Richard asked as Father Thomas handed him a chipped mug of tea. "I was going to demolish your church." The priest settled into another chair, his weathered face thoughtful. "This church has stood for over a century, Mr. Sterling. It has weathered storms far worse than you, but more importantly, it has always been a refuge for those in need, even those who once sought to destroy it." Richard's hands tightened around the warm mug. "I've lost everything, my company, my family, my reputation, all gone in 2 hours, just like—" He trailed off, unwilling to mention the girl's prophecy. "Ah, you met Sarah," Father Thomas said quietly. Richard's head snapped up. "The girl with the Bible, you know her." The priest's expression grew distant. "She appears, sometimes usually to those who need guidance most, always reading her Bible on the steps, always with a message that proves true." "That's impossible," Richard scoffed, but his voice lacked conviction. "She was just a child. This was all just a coincidence. My wife and son's betrayal, the technical problems, the leaked documents." "Was it?" Father Thomas stood and walked to a dusty filing cabinet. After some rummaging, he pulled out an old photograph and handed it to Richard. This was taken in 1962, during the church's 50th anniversary celebration. Richard's hand trembled as he studied the faded image. There, sitting on the church steps, was a young girl with a Bible in her lap. She looked exactly like the child he'd met that morning, down to the worn dress and bare feet. The only difference was that this photo was over 60 years old. "I don't understand," Richard whispered. "Understanding isn't always necessary," Father Thomas replied. "Sometimes acceptance is enough. You built your life on things you could control and explain: money, power, influence. Perhaps it's time to consider that there are forces in this world beyond our understanding or control." A distant roll of thunder punctuated the priest's words. Richard stood abruptly, pacing the small office. "Even if I accept this miracle, what am I supposed to do now? I have nothing left. No money, no home, no family." "You have something far more valuable," Father Thomas said. "You have a chance to rebuild your life on a different foundation. The question is, will you take it?" Before Richard could respond, there was a knock at the office door. A woman in her 60s peered in, her face lined with concern. "Father, the shelter is flooding again. The storm drains are backing up and we have 30 people downstairs." "The basement shelter?" Richard asked, his developer's instincts kicking in despite everything. "That's a serious safety hazard. The building's drainage system needs to be completely overhauled." Father Thomas smiled. "We know, but such repairs are well beyond our means. We do what we can with what we have." Richard found himself walking to the door. "Show me the problem. I may have lost my company, but I still know buildings." As he followed the woman down to the basement, Richard realized this was the first time in decades he'd offered help without calculating what he'd get in return. The thought should have made him uncomfortable, but instead he felt something unfamiliar stirring in his chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with tea or electric heaters. The basement was a scene of organized chaos. Church volunteers were moving supplies to higher ground, while others tried to sweep water toward overwhelmed drains. The space had been converted into a makeshift shelter, with cots and sleeping bags arranged in rows. Men and women of all ages worked together, passing sandbags and moving belongings, their backgrounds and social status erased by their common purpose. Richard rolled up his sleeves, his $1,000 shirt now just wet fabric. "You're approaching this all wrong," he said, surveying the space with an expert eye. "We need to redirect the water flow. Does anyone have paper? I need to sketch out a plan." For the next several hours, Richard forgot about his own troubles as he directed the flood control efforts. His expertise in building systems, once used to maximize profits, now served a different purpose. Under his guidance, the volunteers created makeshift water barriers and cleared blocked drains. By evening, the basement was damp but no longer actively flooding. "You're good at this," said a voice behind him. Richard turned to see a man about his age, but weathered by a harder life. He introduced himself as James, a former architect who'd lost his practice during the financial crisis. "Most people who come to the shelter just want to hide from their problems. You jumped right in and started solving them." Richard wiped sweat from his forehead, his designer suit now thoroughly ruined. "I didn't do it for praise. It was just logical. The problem needed solving." "Isn't it interesting," James mused, "how the same skills can serve such different purposes? This morning, you were going to tear down this church. Tonight, you're helping save it." The observation hit Richard like a physical blow. He looked around the basement shelter with new eyes. The people he would have once dismissed as failures were now working alongside him, offering what little they had to help others. A teenage girl was sharing her dry sweater with an elderly woman. A former stockbroker was serving soup to a young mother and her children. "Mr. Sterling," a church volunteer approached hesitantly. "Father Thomas asked if you'd like to stay the night. The storm's getting worse and we have an extra cot." Richard's first instinct was to refuse. He was Richard Sterling. He didn't sleep on cots in church basements. But then he remembered his frozen bank accounts, his revoked access cards, his disconnected phone. Where else could he go? "Thank you," he said, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. "I appreciate the offer." As he helped set up his cot in a corner of the basement, Richard noticed something that would have been unthinkable that morning. People were smiling at him, Not the fearful, sycophantic smiles he was used to, but genuine expressions of gratitude and acceptance. Father Thomas appeared with a set of dry clothes, simple jeans and a sweater that had been donated to the shelter. "They might not be quite your usual style," the priest said with gentle humor, "but they're warm and dry." Richard changed in the small bathroom, avoiding his reflection in the cracked mirror. The clothes were far from his usual tailored perfection, but they were clean and comfortable. When he emerged, James waved him over to where a group of shelter residents were sharing a simple dinner of soup and bread. "Pull up a chair," James said. "Everyone here has a story. Maybe it's time to share yours." Richard hesitated. His instinct for privacy and control warred with a new, unexpected longing for connection. As he sat down, a familiar figure caught his eye. A small girl with a Bible sitting in the far corner of the basement. But when he blinked, she was gone. "I'm not sure where to begin," Richard admitted, turning back to the group. An elderly woman reached over and patted his hand. "The beginning is usually a good place, dear. We all had a beginning, even if we've forgotten it along the way." Richard looked down at his bowl of soup, remembering the morning's events that felt like a lifetime ago. "This morning I thought I had everything," he began slowly. "I thought I knew exactly who I was and what mattered. Then I met someone who showed me how wrong I was." As he shared his story, Richard felt something shifting inside him. Each word seemed to chip away at the walls he'd built around his heart. Over decades of pursuing wealth and power, the people around him listened without judgment, occasionally nodding in understanding or offering quiet words of encouragement. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but within the church basement, Richard Sterling, former titan of real estate, now just another soul seeking shelter, began to understand what the mysterious girl had meant. Everything he had was indeed gone, but perhaps he was finding something more valuable in its place. Dawn broke over New York City, painting the church's stained glass windows in soft morning light. Richard awoke on his narrow cot, his back stiff, from the unfamiliar bed. For a moment, he expected to find himself in his penthouse suite, the previous day's events nothing but a nightmare. But the sounds of the shelter stirring to life around him confirmed his new reality. "Coffee?" James appeared with 2 steaming paper cups. "It's not your usual premium blend, I'm sure, but it's hot." Richard accepted the cup gratefully, noticing how his hands had already accumulated small calluses from yesterday's work with the flooding. "Thank you. I never thought I'd be so grateful for simple coffee. Amazing what we take for granted, isn't it?" James sat on a nearby crate, blowing on his own coffee. "You know, I used to be like you, always chasing the next big project, the next achievement. Then one market crash wiped out everything I'd built. I thought my life was over." "What changed?" Richard asked, genuinely curious. "I found this place, started using my architectural skills to help with repairs and maintenance, discovered that designing a safe shelter for someone in need felt better than designing luxury penthouses ever did." James smiled. "Speaking of which, Father Thomas mentioned you had some ideas about improving the drainage system." Richard pulled out the sketches he'd made yesterday. Despite everything, his mind had been working on the problem all night. "The current system is completely inadequate. The building needs proper flood prevention, not just emergency responses. See here?" He pointed to his drawings. "With some strategic improvements, we could—" He stopped, reality crashing back. "But it doesn't matter. The church can't afford major renovations, and I no longer have the resources to help." "Maybe not with money," James replied, "but you have something just as valuable. Knowledge, experience, skills. The question is, are you willing to use them differently than before?" Before Richard could respond, a commotion near the shelter entrance caught their attention. A group of new arrivals was being welcomed, a young mother with 2 small children, recently evicted from their apartment. Richard watched as the shelter community immediately mobilized to help them, offering food, clothes, and comfort. "That building," Richard said suddenly, recognizing the address the woman mentioned. "It's one of mine. It was one of mine. The management company must be continuing with the planned evictions." Shame washed over him as he realized how many lives his business decisions had affected. He'd always viewed it as simple market dynamics, luxury developments replacing outdated housing, property values rising through strategic displacement. Now he was seeing the human cost of those abstract business plans. "You know," James said thoughtfully, "there's a meeting this afternoon. Community leaders gathering to discuss the neighborhood's housing crisis. Your insider knowledge could be valuable if you're willing to share it." Richard hesitated. The information he had about planned developments and property transactions was worth millions in the business world, but what was it worth to the people actually living in these neighborhoods? "I'll go," he decided. "But first, I need to figure out something about this drainage system. The next storm could be worse, and these people need a safe shelter." For the next few hours, Richard threw himself into the work. He crawled through maintenance spaces, inspected old blueprints, and drafted detailed plans. Other shelter residents, learning of his expertise, began sharing their own skills and knowledge. A retired plumber offered crucial insights. A construction worker knew where to source affordable materials. Even a teenage girl who excelled at math helped calculate optimal pipe dimensions. As they worked, Richard found himself teaching others what he knew about building systems, but also learning from their practical experience and resourcefulness. It was a different kind of exchange than he was used to, one based on mutual respect rather than monetary transactions. During a break, he stepped outside for fresh air. The church steps were dry now, the storm having passed. Richard sat where he'd first met the mysterious Sarah, trying to make sense of how completely his life had changed in just 24 hours. A shadow fell across him, and he looked up expecting to see the girl again. Instead, he found himself face to face with someone who made his blood run cold. Charles Wagner, his biggest business rival, and the man who had been trying to acquire Sterling properties for years. Wagner's expression was a mixture of amusement and contempt. My, Wagner drawled, his Italian leather shoes gleaming in the morning sun. "How the mighty have fallen. I must say, Richard, homeless chic suits you." Richard stood, acutely aware of his donated clothes and unwashed state. Still, he drew himself up with dignity. "What do you want, Charles?" "To offer you a lifeline, old friend." Wagner's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I know all about your situation, your son's betrayal, your wife's desertion, the frozen accounts, but I also know something they don't. The hidden assets you've tucked away in overseas, investments." Richard's heart skipped a beat. He'd almost forgotten about those contingency funds, carefully hidden away over years of dealing with less than reputable business partners. "I have a proposition," Wagner continued. "Join my company as a senior advisor. Your knowledge of the market is still valuable, even if your reputation is temporarily tarnished. I'll help you access those hidden funds, and together we can start planning your comeback, including," his eyes gleamed, "a proper resolution to this church situation." For a moment, temptation coursed through Richard's veins. He could reclaim his position, his power, his comfortable life. All he had to do was return to his old ways. "The community meeting this afternoon," Wagner added casually. "I know about that too. They're planning to challenge the neighborhood redevelopment plans. But with your insider knowledge of the properties involved, we could ensure things proceed as originally planned. Everyone wins, you get your life back, I get your expertise, and progress marches on." Richard looked back at the church, thinking of the people he'd met in the shelter, the young mother and her children, victims of his own eviction policies. James, who'd lost everything but found a new purpose, Father Thomas, who offered help without judgment, and Sarah, the mysterious girl whose prophecy had set all this in motion. Had she known this moment of choice would come? "Well," Wagner pressed, "shall we discuss the details over lunch at Le Bernardin? My car's waiting." Richard turned back to his former rival. "You know, Charles, it's interesting. Yesterday I would have jumped at this offer, but today—" He smiled, feeling a strange lightness in his chest. "Today I have a drainage system to fix and a community meeting to attend." Wagner's face hardened. "Don't be a fool, Richard. You're nothing now. No money, no influence, no power. What could you possibly accomplish from a church basement?" "I'm beginning to think," Richard replied quietly, "that I'm only just learning what real accomplishment looks like." "You'll regret this," Wagner snapped. When this little spiritual awakening wears off, you'll remember who you really are, and when that happens, don't come crawling back to me." As Wagner stormed off to his waiting limousine, Richard heard soft footsteps behind him. He turned, half expecting to see Sarah again, but it was Father Thomas. "Interesting choice," the priest observed. "The old Richard Sterling would have taken that offer in a heartbeat." Maybe the old Richard Sterling needed to lose everything to see what he really had. Richard watched Wagner's car disappear into traffic. "Father, about that community meeting, I think I might have some information that could help protect this neighborhood. Not just the church, but all the vulnerable properties in the area." "I believe you do," Father Thomas smiled. "But first, shall we see about fixing that drainage system? The forecast calls for more rain next week." As they walked back into the church, Richard felt a presence nearby. In a window's reflection, he caught a glimpse of a small figure with a Bible, smiling approvingly. When he turned, she was gone, but her message remained clear in his heart. Some things really were worth more than money could buy. The church's main hall had been transformed for the community meeting. Folding chairs filled the space where pews usually stood, and hand-drawn maps of the neighborhood covered the walls. Richard sat quietly in the back, observing as people filed in. Small business owners, long-time residents, young activists, and families facing eviction. Many were faces he recognized from the shelter, but others he might have passed countless times on the street without noticing when he was focused only on property values. Emily Chen, owner of a local grocery store that had been in her family for 3 generations, stood at the front of the room. "Thank you all for coming," she began. "As you know, our neighborhood faces an unprecedented threat. The Sterling Wagner development plan would displace hundreds of families and destroy businesses that have served this community for decades." Richard flinched at hearing his name paired with Wagner's. The plan she described had been his creation, a comprehensive redevelopment strategy that would have transformed 12 city blocks into luxury apartments and high-end retail spaces. He had been so proud of its efficiency, its projected profits. Now, listening to Emily detail the human cost, he felt physically ill. "We've gathered evidence of irregular permits," Emily continued, "but the developers have too much influence. The city council meeting next week could be our last chance to stop this." "Maybe not," Richard said quietly, but in the acoustic space of the church his voice carried. The room fell silent as people turned to look at him. Some faces showed recognition, followed by anger. A murmur of discontent spread through the crowd. James stood up. "I think we should listen to what he has to say. Mr. Sterling has chosen to help us at great personal cost." Richard walked to the front of the room, aware of the hostile stares. Just yesterday, he would have dismissed these people's concerns with corporate buzzwords about progress and market forces. Now he saw them as individuals whose lives he had carelessly planned to upend. "The development plan has a fatal flaw," he began, "one that Wagner doesn't know about, but I do. The environmental impact studies weren't just falsified, they were based on outdated geological surveys. There's a reason this neighborhood has flooding problems. The bedrock structure underneath these blocks makes high-rise construction extremely risky." He turned to the maps on the wall, pointing out specific areas. These studies were buried because they would have required expensive foundation work that would have made the project unprofitable. "Wagner plans to use the same flawed data I gathered. But if we can prove the danger at the council meeting—" "Why should we trust you?" someone called out. "You were going to destroy our homes." Richard faced the crowd. "Yes, I was. I won't deny that or try to excuse it, but sometimes it takes losing everything to see what really matters. I know the developer's playbook because I wrote it, and I know how to stop them. If you'll let me help?" Emily studied him thoughtfully. "What exactly are you proposing?" "A complete exposure of the technical flaws in the development plan presented at the city council meeting. But more than that, an alternative proposal. This neighborhood doesn't need luxury condos. It needs affordable housing, improved infrastructure, and preservation of its existing community." He pulled out his drainage system sketches. "Starting with this church, the flooding issues here are a symptom of neighborhood-wide problems that the development would make worse, not better. But with proper engineering, We could turn this challenge into an opportunity. As Richard explained his vision, he saw hope beginning to replace suspicion in people's eyes. He had always been good at presenting plans and winning over audiences, but this was different. For the first time, he was using these skills not for profit, but for protection, not to destroy a community, but to save it. Suddenly, a small figure near the church entrance caught his attention. Sarah stood there, her Bible clutched to her chest, smiling that knowing smile. But this time, she wasn't alone. Next to her stood an elderly woman who made Richard's heart stop. His grandmother, looking exactly as she had 40 years ago when she'd taken him to church as a child, before he'd decided that faith was for the weak and power was all that mattered. He blinked, and they were gone. But their presence left him with a certainty that he was at last on the right path. "Mr. Sterling?" Emily's voice brought him back to the present. "Are you all right?" Richard turned back to the maps, his voice firm with newfound purpose. "Yes. Let me show you where we start." After the meeting, Richard remained in the church hall, studying the neighborhood maps in the fading afternoon light. The other attendees had left with renewed energy and purpose, armed with assignments and responsibilities for the upcoming council meeting. Even those who had initially distrusted him had been won over by his detailed knowledge and obvious sincerity. "Your grandmother would be proud," Father Thomas said quietly, joining him at the maps. Richard turned sharply. "How did you know about my grandmother?" "Sarah told me," the priest replied with a gentle smile. "She knows many things about those she chooses to visit. Your grandmother brought you to this very church when you were young, didn't she?" "Every Sunday," Richard whispered, memories flooding. "Back until she became ill. My parents never believed in anything they couldn't count or control. After she was gone, I forgot everything she tried to teach me. Did you?" Father Thomas gestured around the hall. "Or did those lessons just lie dormant, waiting for the right moment to bloom?" Richard traced the street lines on the map, remembering Sunday walks with his grandmother. She had known everyone in the neighborhood, greeting shopkeepers by name, slipping coins to children, always having time to listen to someone's troubles. He had found it embarrassing then, wanting only to return to his books and studies, his plans for future success. "She believed in something I couldn't understand," Richard said, "a kind of wealth that couldn't be measured in dollars. I thought she was naive. And now I'm wondering if I was the naive one." Richard turned to the priest. "When I saw her just now standing next to Sarah, was it real? Am I losing my mind?" "Reality is more complex than we often assume," Father Thomas replied. "Sometimes, what we call impossible is merely improbable, and what we dismiss as coincidence is actually providence." Their conversation was interrupted by James rushing into the hall, his face flushed with excitement. "Richard, you need to see this. We were checking the old building records like you suggested, and we found something incredible." He spread a set of yellowed blueprints on top of the modern maps. They showed the neighborhood as it had been 50 years ago, including detailed geological surveys. "These prove everything you said about the bedrock issues," James explained, "but look at this notation in the corner." Richard leaned closer, his breath catching as he recognized the signature. "This survey was commissioned by Eleanor Sterling, my grandmother. She was trying to prevent overdevelopment even then," James said. "These documents show she was concerned about the environmental impact of excessive construction in the area. She commissioned private studies, but they were buried by developers at the time." Richard sank into a nearby chair, overwhelmed. All these years, he had been working to undo his grandmother's legacy without even knowing it. The very studies he had ignored and suppressed had been her attempt to protect this community's future. "There's more," James continued excitedly. "The survey includes plans for a sustainable drainage system, similar to what you proposed this morning. It's like she left us a blueprint," Richard finished softly. "Not just for saving the neighborhood, but for doing it right." Father Thomas placed a hand on Richard's shoulder. "Your grandmother understood that true legacy isn't measured in buildings or bank accounts, but in the lives we touch and the communities we nurture." Richard looked up at the stained glass windows, now glowing with sunset colors. I spent my whole life trying to build monuments to my own success, never realizing that the real foundation was laid long ago, by a woman who saw value in people rather than property. As if in response to his words, a familiar figure appeared. In his peripheral vision, Sarah standing near his grandmother's favorite pew, both of them smiling at him before fading away like morning mist. "The council meeting is in 1 week," Richard said, standing with renewed determination. "We have my grandmother's research, my insider knowledge, and the community's support. Now we just have to make sure the truth comes to light." "And Wagner?" James asked. "He won't take this lying down." "No," Richard agreed, "he won't, but I've faced him before with nothing but greed and ambition on my side. This time I have something stronger: faith, truth, and a legacy worth fighting for." The next few days passed in a blur of activity. The church basement had been transformed into a command center, with tables covered in maps, documents, and laptops donated by supporters. Richard worked tirelessly alongside community members, piecing together the puzzle his grandmother had left behind. "Look at this," Emily said one evening, pointing to a faded photograph. "Your grandmother didn't just commission studies, she created a whole alternative development plan for the neighborhood." Richard studied the image. It showed Eleanor Sterling standing in front of the church, surrounded by community leaders of the time. In her hands was a detailed model of the neighborhood that looked nothing like the steel and glass monuments he had planned to build. She envisioned green spaces, James noted, comparing the photo to Eleanor's original blueprints. Community gardens, local businesses, affordable housing, all designed to work with the natural landscape instead of against it. "The opposite of everything I tried to do," Richard said quietly. He picked up another document, his grandmother's elegant handwriting still clear after all these years. "A community is not built on profit margins, but on the bonds between its people." As they worked, more residents came forward with memories of Eleanor Sterling. She had helped countless families stay in their homes during hard times, often anonymously paying bills or providing emergency loans. The neighborhood children had called her Angel Eleanor, because she seemed to appear whenever someone needed help. "Just like Sarah," Richard murmured, glancing toward the church steps where he often caught glimpses of the mysterious girl. A knock at the door interrupted their research. Linda Martinez, owner of the local diner, entered carrying several bags of food. "Thought you all could use some dinner," she said, setting out containers of homemade soup and sandwiches. "Linda," Richard said suddenly, "your diner, it was one of the properties scheduled for demolition in the first phase of development." She nodded grimly. "Third-generation business. My grandfather started it with a loan from your grandmother, actually. She believed in his dream when the banks wouldn't give him the time of day." Richard's mind raced. "The loan documents. Do you still have them?" Linda disappeared and returned an hour later with a dusty box from her diner's office. Inside were not just loan papers, but letters, photographs, and detailed plans for what Eleanor had called the Heritage Project. "This is incredible," James exclaimed, spreading the documents across the table. She wasn't just trying to preserve buildings, she was protecting the whole cultural fabric of the neighborhood. These covenants, these legal structures, she built in safeguards we never knew existed. Richard studied the papers with growing amazement. His grandmother had created a complex legal framework designed to protect key properties and businesses from exactly the kind of development he and Wagner had planned. The documents had been filed quietly over decades, buried in property deeds and municipal records. "But if these protections exist," Emily asked, "why haven't they stopped the development?" "Because no one knew to look for them," Richard replied. "Wagner's legal team is searching for modern obstacles, not protections put in place 50 years ago. But now—" He trailed off as Sarah appeared in the doorway, holding her ever-present Bible. This time she opened it and pointed to a passage, before vanishing. "The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone," Father Thomas, who had been quietly observing, spoke up. "Your grandmother believed that true wealth lies in community, in connections, in the sacred bonds between people and place. She left these breadcrumbs knowing that someday someone would need to follow them." "Not someone," Richard said softly. "Me. She knew. Somehow, She knew I would lose my way and need to find it again. As if in response to his words, a warm breeze swept through the basement, rustling the papers and carrying the faint scent of the perfume his grandmother had worn. Richard picked up one of her letters, reading her final words on the Heritage Project. To whoever finds these plans, remember that every building has a soul, every street holds stories, and every community guards treasures more valuable than gold. Our task is not to count our wealth, but to protect what truly matters. Richard looked around the basement at the diverse group of people working together to save their neighborhood. In just a few days, they had become more than allies. They were becoming family, just as his grandmother had always taught him community should be. "We have 3 days until the council meeting," he announced. "Let's make sure every one of these legal protections is documented, every covenant is verified, and every story is ready to be told. Wagner thinks he's fighting for property rights, but we're fighting for something far more precious." As the group returned to work with renewed purpose, Richard caught a glimpse of his reflection in a window. For a moment, he saw not the ruthless developer he had been, but the man his grandmother had always believed he could become. The night before the council meeting, Richard couldn't sleep. He sat in the church sanctuary, the moonlight streaming through the stained glass windows, creating patterns on the floor. The past week had transformed him in ways he was only beginning to understand. His phone, a basic model James had lent him, buzzed with a message. It was Marcus, his son, reaching out for the first time since the takeover. "Wagner's planning something. Be careful tomorrow. Despite everything, I don't want to see you hurt." Richard stared at the message, emotions warring in his heart. His son's betrayal had set all this in motion, yet now Marcus was warning him. Before he could respond, another message arrived. "Did you know about Grandma Eleanor's work in the neighborhood? Why didn't you ever tell me about her?" "Because I wanted to forget," Richard whispered to the empty church. "Because she represented everything I thought made me weak. She represented everything that makes you strong," a small voice said. Richard turned to find Sarah sitting in the pew behind him, her Bible open on her lap. "You knew her, didn't you?" Richard asked. "Not just as a vision or a spirit. You knew my grandmother when she was alive." Sarah smiled, that timeless smile. "I know all the angels who walk these streets, Mr. Sterling. Your grandmother was one of the finest. She knew that true strength lies not in what you can take, but in what you can give." "Wagner will try to discredit us tomorrow," Richard said. "He'll have his lawyers, his experts, his political connections." "And what do you have?" Sarah asked. Richard thought about the community that had welcomed him, taught him, forgiven him. He thought about his grandmother's legacy, preserved in documents and memories. He thought about the mysterious girl before him who had appeared at exactly the right moment to set him on a new path. "I have the truth," he answered, "and maybe for the first time in my life, I have faith." Sarah nodded approvingly. "Then you have everything you need." She stood, clutching her Bible. "Your grandmother asked me to give you something when you were ready to receive it." She held out a small, worn key. Richard recognized it immediately. It had hung on a chain around his grandmother's neck for as long as he could remember. "In the church tower," Sarah said, "there's a small room. Eleanor kept her most important papers there, things she knew would be needed when the time was right." Richard took the key with trembling hands. "Why didn't you give this to me before?" "Because you weren't ready to understand what wealth truly means. Now you are." Before he could ask more questions, Sarah was gone, leaving only the key as proof she had been there at all. Richard hurried to the church tower, climbing the narrow stairs until he found a small wooden door. The key fitted perfectly. Inside was a simple room with a single window overlooking the neighborhood. Moonlight illuminated a desk covered with papers, all in his grandmother's handwriting. But what caught his eye was an envelope with his name on it, dated just days before she left this world. "My dearest Richard," the letter began, "if you're reading this, then you've finally found your way back to what matters most. I've watched you build your towers of steel and glass, thinking they would make you strong. But true strength, my darling, boy, comes from the foundations we build in people's hearts." Tears blurred Richard's vision as he read his grandmother's final message to him. She had seen it all coming. His rise to power, his fall from grace, and most importantly, his chance for redemption. The letter ended with a passage that made his heart stop. When you meet Sarah, remember that angels come in many forms. Some wear business suits, others wear worn-out shoes, but all of them carry the same message, that love is the only investment that never fails. Richard sat in his grandmother's secret room until dawn, reading through her papers, understanding, at last, the true legacy she had left him. As the sun rose over the neighborhood she had worked so hard to protect, he gathered the documents they would need for the council meeting. "Thank you, Grandma," he whispered, locking the room behind him. "I finally understand." As he descended the tower stairs, he heard the church coming to life below. The community was gathering for one final strategy session before the council meeting. His community now, he realized, the one his grandmother had always known he would find his way back to. The city council chamber was packed to capacity. Television cameras lined the back wall, their red lights blinking like watchful eyes. Richard sat with the community group, no longer in expensive suits, but wearing clean, borrowed clothes. Wagner and his team of lawyers occupied the other side of the room, their collective wealth evident in every designer accessory and perfectly pressed suit. "Quite a fall," Wagner commented loudly enough for his voice to carry. "From penthouse to pauper in less than a week. I'm still willing to help you recover, Richard. Last chance." Richard didn't respond. He was focused on organizing Eleanor's documents with Emily and James. The community had turned out in force, shopkeepers, residents, elderly people who remembered Eleanor Sterling's kindness, children whose futures hung in the balance. The Atheist council president called the meeting to order. Wagner's team presented first, their slick PowerPoint presentation full of impressive projections and artistic renderings of gleaming towers. "This development will bring billions in investment to our city," Wagner concluded smoothly. "Jobs, tax revenue, progress, all we need is to clear away a few outdated structures. Change is inevitable. The only question is whether we'll profit from it." Richard noticed several council members nodding. He had given similar presentations countless times, knowing exactly which buttons to push, which promises to make. But now he saw through the glossy facade to the hollow core beneath. When it was their turn, Richard approached the podium. He could feel Wagner's smug gaze, expecting another corporate presentation. Instead, Richard gestured to Linda Martinez. "Before I begin," he said, "I'd like you to hear from someone who knows this neighborhood's true value." Linda stepped forward, her hands trembling slightly as she held up an old photograph. "This is my grandfather's first day at his diner. The woman standing next to him is Eleanor Sterling. When no bank would loan to an immigrant with dreams but no collateral, she believed in him. That diner put 3 generations through college. It's where I met my husband, where my children took their first steps." Mr. Wagner's plan would replace it with a valet parking structure. One by one, community members shared their stories. Emily Chen spoke about her grocery store that provided fresh food to elderly residents who couldn't travel to supermarkets. A teacher described how the church's after-school programs had kept countless kids on the right path. Then Richard stood again. "You've heard about what this neighborhood means to its people. Now let me show you what Wagner's development would really mean." He projected Eleanor's geological surveys onto the screen. "These studies, commissioned by my grandmother 50 years ago, show why this area has persistent flooding issues. The bedrock structure makes it unsuitable for high-rise development. Wagner's environmental impact studies ignore these fundamental problems, the same ones I chose to ignore when this was my project." Murmurs rippled through the chamber. Wagner's lawyers huddled together, whispering urgently. "But my grandmother left more than warnings," Richard continued. "She left solutions." He displayed Eleanor's alternative development plans, a sustainable neighborhood that works with the landscape instead of against it, affordable housing integrated with green spaces, local businesses preserved and enhanced, and, most importantly, legal protections she put in place to ensure this community's survival. Wagner shot to his feet. "This is absurd. Those documents are ancient history. The property rights are clear. We have contracts, agreements." "Actually," Richard said calmly, "you don't." He projected an image of one of Eleanor's legal documents. My grandmother created a community land trust 50 years ago. Key properties throughout this neighborhood are legally protected from exactly this kind of development. These protections were buried in property deeds and municipal codes, waiting for the moment they'd be needed. The council chamber erupted in chaos. Wagner's lawyers frantically flipped through papers, while council members whispered among themselves. But Richard wasn't finished. "Look around this room," he said, his voice cutting through the noise. "These people aren't numbers on a spreadsheet or obstacles to progress. They're the heart of our city. My grandmother understood that true wealth isn't built in luxury penthouses. It's built in communities where people look out for each other." As he spoke, he caught a glimpse of Sarah standing in the back of the chamber, his grandmother beside her. They smiled at him before fading away, but their presence gave him strength to deliver his final words. "I stand before you as someone who once would have destroyed this neighborhood without a second thought, but I've been given a second chance to see what really matters. The question isn't whether we'll profit from change, it's whether we'll protect what's truly valuable before it's lost forever." The council chamber fell silent as Richard's words hung in the air. Even Wagner seemed momentarily speechless, his usual arrogance replaced by uncertainty. The council president called for a brief recess to review the newly presented documents. In the hallway outside, the community gathered around Richard. "Whatever happens," Emily said, squeezing his knee, "and you've given us hope. That's worth more than any development." James appeared with his laptop. "The media is already running with the story. Real estate tycoon's redemption. Grandson carries on Eleanor Sterling's legacy of community protection." The public response is overwhelming. Before Richard could respond, he heard a familiar voice. "Dad?" Marcus stood awkwardly at the edge of the group, looking younger and less certain than the polished executive who had orchestrated Richard's downfall just days ago. "I never knew about Grandma Eleanor," Marcus said quietly. "All those years, you taught me that power was everything, that sentiment was weakness. But she built something stronger than steel and glass, didn't she?" Richard looked at his son, really seeing him for the first time in years. "I taught you what I thought I knew. I was wrong. Your grandmother tried to teach me what really matters, but I wouldn't listen. Maybe it's not too late for either of us to learn." Marcus hesitated, then pulled out his phone. "Wagner's been working with some questionable investors. I have proof that—" "No," Richard interrupted gently. "We don't need to win that way. Your grandmother left us everything we need. We just have to trust in the truth she protected." The council president called them back into session. Wagner's lawyers had mounted a desperate counter-argument, claiming the old documents were irrelevant or possibly forged. But with each attempt to discredit Eleanor's legacy, more community members stood to verify her work, her presence, her impact on their lives. Finally, the council president called for a vote. One by one, the council members spoke, many sharing their own memories of Eleanor Sterling and the neighborhood she had fought to protect. The vote was unanimous. Wagner's development plan was rejected. The community land trust would be formally reinstated, with additional protections put in place. The church and its surrounding neighborhood would be preserved. Wagner stormed out of the chamber, his legal team scurrying behind him. But Richard barely noticed. He was surrounded by celebrating community members, their joy and relief washing over him like a healing wave. Father Thomas appeared at his side. "Your grandmother would be proud," he said softly, "not just of what you've done, but of who you've become." "I saw her," Richard admitted. "Her and Sarah during my testimony. Was it real?" The priest smiled. "What do you think?" Before Richard could answer, Linda's daughter came running up. "Mr. Sterling, there's something you need to see at the church." The entire community made their way back to the church, the celebration continuing as they walked. But when they reached the steps, everyone fell silent. The late afternoon sun hit the stained glass windows at a perfect angle, creating a rainbow of light that fell exactly where Sarah usually sat. And there, carved into the stone step, were words Richard had never noticed before. "To those who seek true wealth, look not to the heights of towers, but to the depths of love." Eleanor Sterling, 1973. Richard knelt to touch the carved words, feeling the warmth of the sun on his face. He remembered Sarah's first prophecy about losing everything, but now he understood. He hadn't lost what mattered. He had finally found it. Marcus stepped forward to stand beside him. "Dad, I'd like to hear more about Grandma Eleanor. And maybe we could look at her plans for the neighborhood together, not to develop, but to protect, to continue what she started." Richard stood, putting an arm around his son's shoulders. The community around them was already discussing plans for renovation, preservation, celebration. New connections were being forged, old wounds healing, hope taking root and growing like Eleanor's beloved community gardens. Sarah appeared one last time at the top of the steps, her Bible glowing in the evening light. Beside her stood Eleanor, looking exactly as she had when she had first shown young Richard the neighborhood she loved so dearly. They smiled down at him before fading into the golden light. "Yes," Richard said to his son, but also to the memory of the two figures in the light. "Let's build something that will last, not in steel and glass, but in hearts and hope." Spring arrived in the neighborhood, bringing with it signs of renewal, both literal and symbolic. The church's drainage system had been completely renovated, with Richard and James overseeing a team of local contractors. The basement shelter, once prone to flooding, was now dry and secure, transformed into a proper community center. Richard stood in what had once been his grandmother's secret room in the church tower, now converted into a small office for the newly established Eleanor Sterling Community Trust. The desk where he'd found her letters was still there, but now it held new papers, plans for neighborhood improvements, grant applications, and letters from other communities seeking advice on protecting their own heritage. "The garden center called," Emily said, entering with a stack of fresh documents. "The first shipment of trees for the pocket parks arrives next week, and the Historical Society approved our renovation permits for the old theater." Richard smiled, remembering how that same theater had once been on his demolition list. Now it was being restored to serve as both a cinema and community arts space, funded partly by a grant Marcus had secured through his business connections. "Have you seen today's drawings?" Emily handed him a collection of children's artwork. The neighborhood school had asked students to draw their dreams for the community, and the results were both touching and inspiring. One picture showed the church with rainbow light streaming from its windows. In the foreground, a small figure, in a simple dress, held what looked like a book. "Sarah," Richard whispered, touching the crayon drawing gently. "The girl who drew that, Jenny Martinez, Linda's granddaughter, said she sees her sometimes, sitting on the steps reading. She said Sarah told her that angels watch over places where love is stronger than money." Before Richard could respond, James burst into the office, his face alight with excitement. "You won't believe what we found in the theater basement. Original blueprints from the 1920s, and look who signed off on the restoration work in 1973. He laid out a yellow document bearing Eleanor Sterling's elegant signature. But next to it was another signature that made Richard's heart stop. The architect's name was James Harrison, current James's father. "Your father worked with my grandmother?" Richard asked in amazement. James nodded, his eyes misty. "I had no idea. Dad never talked much about his work before the financial troubles hit. But look at these designs, the community spaces, the affordable housing units above the theater. They were trying to build exactly what we're doing now." The door chimed downstairs, and Father Thomas's voice floated up. "Richard, you have some visitors." Descending to the church's main level, Richard found Marcus waiting with Victoria, his first time seeing his wife since the day everything changed. She looked different, softer somehow, without the rigid perfection she'd always maintained as his corporate spouse. "I've been thinking," Victoria said, after an awkward moment, "about what you said at the council meeting, about what really matters, our marriage. It was all about appearances, wasn't it? We lost sight of anything real." "We both did," Richard acknowledged. "I was so focused on building an empire, I forgot to build a home." Victoria gestured to the busy church around them, community members coming and going, children running through the halls, elderly residents gathering for their weekly social hour. But you've found one now, haven't you? A real one? Marcus stepped forward, holding a familiar leather-bound book. We found this in Grandma Eleanor's things at the penthouse. I thought it belonged here. It was a photo album filled with pictures of the neighborhood through the years. Eleanor appeared in many of them, always surrounded by community members. Always with that gentle smile Richard remembered. And there, in a photo from 1973, stood Eleanor with James's father and a group of community leaders, including a small girl in a simple dress, holding a Bible. Impossible, Victoria whispered. But there was no denying it. Sarah's face, unchanged by time, smiled out from the decades-old photograph. I'm beginning to think, Richard said quietly, that impossible just means we're not looking with the right eyes. The afternoon light streamed through the stained glass windows, creating pools of color on the worn wooden floors. Somewhere, in the building, children laughed, piano music played, and the sounds of a community very much alive echoed through the halls. Victoria touched the photo album gently. Tell me about her? About Eleanor? I'd like to understand, to really understand, what you've found here. Richard looked at his wife and son, then at the community members going about their daily lives in the church his grandmother had helped protect. Why don't we all have dinner at Linda's diner? The story makes more sense over her apple pie. It's from Eleanor's recipe, you know. As they walked through the neighborhood together, Richard noticed how many buildings bore small plaques now, protected by the Eleanor Sterling Community Trust. Each one represented not just a physical structure, but a piece of the legacy his grandmother had entrusted to him, a legacy of faith, hope, and the kind of wealth that couldn't be measured in dollars. Linda's diner was busy that evening, filled with the warm aroma of coffee and baking pies. The Martinez family had restored the interior to its original 1950s style, with photos of the neighborhood's history lining the walls. Richard, Victoria, and Marcus settled into a corner booth, while Linda herself brought over coffee and a freshly baked apple pie. Eleanor's special recipe, Linda said with a wink. She always said the secret ingredient was love, but I think it might be the honey, she added to the crust. As they ate, Richard shared stories about his grandmother, not just the recent discoveries but memories from his childhood that he'd buried beneath years of ambition and cynicism. Victoria and Marcus listened intently, occasionally asking questions or sharing their own perspectives on how things might have been different if they'd known. I keep thinking about that photo, Marcus said, referring to the image of Sarah from 1973. How is it possible? And why didn't we ever see her? Before? Perhaps, a familiar voice said, you weren't ready to see. They all turned to find Sarah standing beside their booth, her Bible clutched to her chest as always. This time she didn't vanish. Instead, she slid into the empty seat next to Marcus, seeming both ethereal and surprisingly solid. Eleanor knew that true vision comes from the heart, not the eyes, Sarah continued, her ageless eyes twinkling. She saw what this neighborhood could be, what all of you could be, long before anyone else did. Victoria stared at the girl in amazement. Are you real? Sarah smiled that knowing smile. As real as faith, as real as love, as real as the bonds that hold a community together. Eleanor asked me to watch over this place, to guide those who lost their way back to what matters most. But what are you? Marcus whispered. I'm a reminder, Sarah replied simply. A reminder that wealth isn't always visible, that power isn't always strong, that the most important things in life can't be bought or sold. Eleanor understood this. Now you do too. She turned to Richard. Your grandmother's work isn't finished. Other communities need protection. Other hearts need awakening. Will you continue her legacy? Richard looked at his family, at the diner full of community members, at the neighborhood visible through the windows, the neighborhood he had once planned to destroy and now worked to preserve. Yes, he said, firmly. We will. Sarah beamed. Then my work here is almost done. She stood, leaving her Bible on the table. Eleanor wanted you to have this. Inside you'll find her notes, her prayers, her dreams for this community, and others like it. Let it guide you as it guided her. Before anyone could respond, the bell above the diner door chimed. When they turned back, Sarah was gone. But there, on the table lay Eleanor's Bible, its well-worn pages filled with her handwritten notes and observations. Richard opened it carefully, finding a marked passage. "Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." In the margin, Eleanor had written, "True wealth builds communities, not walls. Look for the angels among us, they appear when we need them most." As if in response to these words, the evening sunlight streamed through the diner's windows, creating a rainbow effect similar to the church's stained glass. For a moment, Richard thought he saw two figures in the light, Sarah and Eleanor, standing together, watching over the community they had both worked to protect. Victoria reached across the table and took Richard's hand. Marcus placed his hand over theirs. Outside, the neighborhood buzzed with life, children playing in the newly established pocket parks, elderly residents chatting on benches, shop owners closing up for the day. The sound of church bells floated on the evening air, calling the community to gather, to connect, to celebrate the bonds that held them together. "So," Linda said, appearing with fresh coffee, "who's ready to hear about Eleanor's plans for the summer festival? We found her original notes in the diner's archives, and let me tell you, that woman knew how to bring people together." As Linda pulled up a chair to join them, Richard looked around at his family, his community, his home. He thought about the journey that had brought him here, from the heights of material success to the depths of loss, and finally to the discovery of what true wealth really meant. The Bible on the table seemed to glow in the evening light, a testament to faith, hope, and the kind of love that builds communities strong enough to withstand any storm. Eleanor's legacy lived on, not in towers of steel and glass, but in the hearts of those she had taught to see with different eyes. The Eleanor Sterling Community Trust Office buzzed with activity as representatives from neighborhoods across the city gathered to learn about protecting their own communities. Richard stood before Eleanor's old map of the city, now updated with markers showing other areas facing similar development pressures. "Brooklyn Heights is next," Emily explained, pointing to a cluster of red pins. "They reached out after hearing about our success, another historic neighborhood facing aggressive development." James added colored strings connecting various points on the map. "Look at the pattern. It's almost exactly what Eleanor predicted in her notes. She saw how development would spread, targeting the most vulnerable communities first." Richard studied the map, remembering how he used to view the city as a collection of properties to be acquired and transformed. Now he saw it as Eleanor had, a living tapestry of interconnected communities, each with its own story to protect. "Mr. Sterling?" A young woman stepped forward, introducing herself as Rebecca Chen, Emily's niece and a law student. "I've been studying Grandma Eleanor's legal frameworks. The way she structured the community land trust, it's brilliant. We could adapt this model for other neighborhoods." Victoria, who had been quietly reviewing documents in the corner, looked up. The Sterling Foundation's resources could help. Instead of funding luxury developments, we could support community preservation. She caught Richard's surprised look. "What? I'm still on the board, and Marcus agrees it's time for a new direction." Marcus nodded, pulling up financial projections on his laptop. "We've already identified 10 neighborhoods that could benefit from similar protection. The Foundation's legal team is ready to help implement Grandma Eleanor's frameworks." Richard picked up Eleanor's Bible, which now sat in a place of honor on his desk. Opening it to one of her marked passages, he read, "A good tree bears good fruit." In the margin, she had written, "What we protect today grows to shelter tomorrow." As if in response to these words, a familiar figure appeared in the doorway. Jenny Martinez, Linda's granddaughter, holding a new drawing. "Look, Mr. Sterling, I drew Sarah again, but this time she's in all the neighborhoods." The child's artwork showed the city from above, with small figures in simple dresses reading books in different communities. Each figure was surrounded by a gentle glow that connected to the others like a web of light. "She told me to tell you something," Jenny said seriously. "She said, the angels are everywhere, watching and waiting. They just need people to help them protect what matters." Father Thomas, who had been quietly observing, stepped forward to examine the drawing. "Out of the mouths of babes," he murmured. "Eleanor always said that children could see what adults often miss." A knock at the door interrupted them. A group of community leaders from Brooklyn Heights had arrived for their meeting. Richard watched as Emily and James welcomed them, bringing out Eleanor's original documents to show how the protection frameworks could be adapted. Victoria moved to stand beside him. "You know what I realized? When we were building towers, we were really building walls, separating people, communities, lives. But this," she gestured to the room full of people sharing ideas and hope, "this builds bridges." The afternoon sun streamed through the tower window, casting that familiar rainbow light across the gathering. In its glow, Richard caught a glimpse of Sarah sitting on the windowsill, Eleanor standing behind her with a proud smile. They nodded encouragingly before fading away. "Mr. Sterling," one of the Brooklyn Heights representatives approached, "we brought our neighborhood records going back 50 years. You'll never believe what we found." She held out a faded photograph, showing a community meeting from 1974. There, among the participants, stood Eleanor Sterling, and beside her, a small girl with a Bible. "She was there too," Richard whispered. "Angels go where they're needed," Father Thomas said softly, "and right now, they're needed everywhere." Richard looked around the room at the growing movement his grandmother had set in motion decades ago. The maps, the legal documents, the community representatives, the children's drawings, all pieces of a legacy that was only beginning to reveal its true scope. "Then we'd better get to work," he said, picking up Eleanor's Bible and turning to a fresh page in his notebook. "Tell us about your neighborhood. Tell us your story. Let's see how we can help you protect what matters most." Summer bloomed in the city, bringing with it the first Eleanor Sterling Community Festival. The neighborhood had transformed. Once empty, lots now housed community gardens, restored buildings gleamed with fresh paint, and everywhere there were signs of life and connection. Richard stood on the church steps, watching children play in the newly installed sprinklers that doubled as flood control features. The old theater across the street was screening classic films again, its marquee proudly displaying "Community. Movie night, all welcome." Linda's Diner had tables set up on the sidewalk, serving Eleanor's famous apple pie to a constant stream of visitors. "Hard to believe this was almost all torn down," Marcus said, joining his father. He had rolled up the sleeves of his usual business shirt, having just finished helping set up game booths with local teenagers. "Wagner's latest project is falling apart, by the way. Turns out other neighborhoods are finding similar protective frameworks in their records." Eleanor thought of everything, Richard mused. She knew other communities would need protection, too. Victoria appeared with a stack of flyers for the Brooklyn Heights Preservation Project. Her corporate polish had softened into something more genuine, more connected. "The Sterling Foundation's new community support initiative is official. The board approved it unanimously this morning." James rushed up, excitement written across his face. "Richard, you need to see this. We found more of my father's old architectural plans." He and Eleanor were designing sustainable community spaces all over the city. "Look at the dates, they span decades." Before Richard could respond, a familiar small voice piped up, "They were planning for this moment." Sarah sat on her usual spot on the steps, but this time she wasn't alone. Beside her was a young Eleanor Sterling, looking exactly as she had in the 1973 photograph. Both of them smiled at the gathered family. "The seeds we plant today grow into tomorrow's forests," Eleanor said, her voice just as Richard remembered. "I knew you'd find your way back, darling. You just needed a little angelic guidance." "Grandma," Marcus whispered. Victoria gripped Richard's hand tightly. "The work isn't finished," Sarah added, "but now you understand how to continue it. True wealth grows in the heart of community. Your grandmother taught you that. Now you can teach others." "Will we see you again?" Richard asked, his voice thick with emotion. Eleanor's smile deepened. "We're always here, watching over what matters most. Sarah will appear when she's needed, just as she always has. And as for me..." She looked around. "At the vibrant community celebration, I live on in every life touched by this work, every community preserved, every heart open to what really matters." A group of children ran past, chasing bubbles in the summer air. When Richard looked back, Sarah and Eleanor were gone, but their presence lingered in the laughter of children, the conversations of neighbors, the sense of belonging that filled the streets. Father Thomas emerged from the church carrying Eleanor's Bible. "I think it's time for this to take its next journey," he said, handing it to Richard. "Brooklyn Heights needs guidance, and Eleanor's words have more wisdom to share." Richard opened the Bible to a random page, finding a note in his grandmother's handwriting he hadn't seen before. "To those who come after, remember that every community has its angels, every street holds its stories, and every heart can learn to see what truly matters. The greatest wealth we can build is the bonds between people. Guard them well." The festival continued around them, a testament to Eleanor's vision. Families shared meals at long tables in the street. Children played games organized by teenagers. Elderly residents told stories of the neighborhood's history to eager listeners. The community had not just been preserved, it had been renewed, strengthened, brought to life in ways even Eleanor might not have imagined. Richard looked at his family, Victoria discussing community programs with Emily, Marcus learning the secret of Eleanor's apple pie from Linda, James examining old blueprints with young architects interested in community-focused design. He thought about all the other neighborhoods reaching out for help, all the communities waiting to be protected and renewed. The summer breeze carried the sound of church bells, children's laughter, and the endless possibilities of hope. Somewhere, Richard knew, Sarah and Eleanor were watching, their work continuing through each person who chose to see with the heart rather than the eyes, who chose to build bridges rather than walls, who chose to believe in the power of community and faith. As the sun began to set, its light caught the church's stained glass windows, sending ribbons of color across the celebrating neighborhood. And in that light, if you knew how to look, you might see a small girl with a Bible, sitting beside a woman with a gentle smile, watching over the community they had helped to save, angels among us guarding what matters most. Autumn painted the city in warm colors, as the Eleanor Sterling Community Trust's influence continued to grow. The Brooklyn Heights project had become a stunning success, inspiring other neighborhoods to seek similar protection. Richard now split his time between different communities, sharing Eleanor's wisdom and helping implement her preservation frameworks. One crisp morning, he stood in a small park in Queens, where another neighborhood was fighting to preserve its character. Rebecca Chen, now a full-time legal advocate for the trust, was explaining Eleanor's property protection strategies to local leaders. "Look at this," she said, spreading out documents on a portable table. "We found the same pattern here. Your neighborhood's original deeds contain protective clauses similar to what Eleanor Sterling established. They've been dormant for decades, but they're still legally binding." An elderly man stepped forward, his eyes wide with recognition. "I remember Ms. Sterling," he said. "She visited our neighborhood association in 1975. There was a young girl with her carrying a Bible." Richard and Rebecca exchanged knowing looks. The pattern was becoming familiar. Everywhere Eleanor's protective frameworks were discovered, stories of Sarah emerged as well. "Dad," Marcus called, hurrying across the park, "you need to see this." He carried a laptop showing news headlines. Wagner Development Corporation files for bankruptcy. The company's aggressive development strategies had backfired as more communities discovered and activated their legal protections. "It's not just Wagner," Marcus continued. "Developers across the city are having to change their approach. The Sterling Foundation's new community-focused development guidelines are becoming the standard. Even my old business partners are asking for advice on sustainable neighborhood preservation." Victoria arrived with Emily, both carrying stacks of papers. "The mayor's office called," Victoria announced. "They want to establish a citywide community heritage protection program based on Eleanor's model. They're asking for our help to implement it." Emily spread out a new map on the table. "Look at how it's spreading. Each protected community becomes a catalyst for others. Eleanor's vision is creating a network of preserved neighborhoods, each maintaining its unique character while supporting the others." As they discussed the expanding movement, a group of children played nearby. One little girl sat apart from the others, reading a book under a maple tree. Richard watched as she looked up and smiled, that same timeless, knowing smile he'd come to know so well. "Mr. Sterling," A local resident approached hesitantly. "We found something in our community center archives. It's a letter from Eleanor Sterling, dated 1976. He handed Richard a yellowed envelope. Inside, Richard found his grandmother's elegant handwriting. "To the guardians of this neighborhood, if you're reading this, it means the time has come to awaken the protections I helped put in place. Remember that a community is more than buildings and streets. It's a living tapestry of lives, hopes, and connections. The foundations we lay today must be strong enough to support not just walls, but dreams. Look for the signs. An angel walks among you, carrying wisdom in the form of a book. She appears when faith is needed most, when the value of community must outweigh the price of progress. Trust in what you can't see, but can feel in your heart. Every neighborhood has its own story, its own soul. Protect these precious things, for they are the true wealth of our city. With faith and hope, Eleanor Sterling." As Richard finished reading, a breeze stirred the autumn leaves. The little girl under the maple tree stood, clutching her book, and for a moment appeared to be surrounded by a gentle glow. She walked toward the group of community leaders, her simple dress unchanged by time or fashion. "Your grandmother's work grows like a tree," Sarah said, her voice carrying that familiar mixture of youth and ancient wisdom. "Each protected community is a new branch, reaching toward the light, creating shelter for others to grow." And the local leaders stared in amazement, but Richard had learned to accept these moments of divine intervention. "Will it be enough?" he asked. "The city is so big and there are so many communities in need." Sarah smiled. "Look around you. Every person here is a seed of change." Eleanor knew that true protection comes not just from legal documents, but from awakened hearts. Each person who understands this becomes a guardian, carrying the message forward. She opened her Bible, showing a pressed maple leaf marking a passage. "Faith, as small as a mustard seed, can move mountains." Or save communities, Rebecca added softly, understanding dawning in her eyes. The autumn sunlight seemed to intensify around Sarah, and in its glow appeared Eleanor, looking out at the growing movement she had set in motion so many years ago. Grandmother and angel stood together, their presence a bridge between past and future, between heaven and earth. Winter melted into spring, and with the new season came a special gathering at the original church that had started it all. Community leaders from across the city filled the restored building, each carrying stories of transformation and renewal. The Eleanor Sterling Community Trust had grown into a movement that was changing not just neighborhoods, but hearts and minds. Richard stood at the podium, looking out at faces both familiar and new. Victoria sat in the front row beside Marcus, both of them now fully dedicated to the Trust's mission. James and Emily managed an expanding network of community preservation projects. Rebecca led a team of lawyers specialized in protecting neighborhood heritage. "A year ago," Richard began, "I stood on these steps as a different man, someone who measured wealth in dollars and success in square footage. I thought I was going to tear down this church. Instead, this church rebuilt me." He held up Eleanor's Bible, its pages now filled with additional notes from communities across the city. "My grandmother left us more than just legal frameworks and property protections. She left us a new way of seeing, a vision of what our city could be when we value community over profit, connection over construction." The afternoon light streamed through the stained glass windows, creating that familiar kaleidoscope of colors. In its glow, Richard saw Sarah sitting in her usual spot, Eleanor standing beside her. But they weren't alone. Other figures appeared. With them, angels watching over other neighborhoods, each carrying their own books of wisdom and hope. Linda Martinez stepped forward with her granddaughter Jenny. "We found more of Eleanor's recipes," she announced. "Not just for apple pie, but for life itself. Notes about bringing people together, nurturing connections, feeding not just bodies but souls." From Brooklyn Heights, a community leader shared how their preserved neighborhood had become a model for others. From Queens, residents described how protecting their heritage had strengthened their future. Each story added a thread to the tapestry Eleanor had begun weaving so many years ago. "The work continues," Sarah said, her voice carrying in the quiet church. Each community that awakens to its true value becomes a light for others. The angels walk where they're needed, but it's the people who must choose to see, to believe, to protect what matters most. Eleanor stepped forward, looking exactly as she had when Richard was a child. "My darling boy," she said softly, "you finally understand. True wealth isn't built in towers reaching toward the sky. It's built in communities reaching toward each other." The gathered leaders watched in amazement as more figures appeared in the rainbow light. Angels who had visited other neighborhoods, guided other hearts, protected other communities. Each carried a book, each wore a simple dress, each shared Sarah's timeless smile. "The city is changing," Marcus observed, wonder in his voice. "Not in the way developers planned, but in the way Grandma Eleanor dreamed." Victoria squeezed Richard's hand. "And Wagner's empire?" "Being transformed," Rebecca answered. "The new owners are converting the properties into affordable housing and community spaces. They're using Eleanor's guidelines." Richard looked out, at the assembled communities, then back at the gathering of angels. Sarah opened her Bible one last time, showing him a final message. "What is planted in faith grows forever." "Our work isn't finished," Richard told the gathering. "There are more communities to protect, more hearts to open, more connections to build. But today, we celebrate what Eleanor Sterling knew all along, that the greatest wealth we can possess is the love we share, the communities we build, and the legacy we leave for others." The angels began to fade in the afternoon light, but their presence lingered in the renewed spirit of the communities they had helped save. Eleanor's last smile to her grandson carried all the pride and love she had always held for him, now fulfilled, in ways neither could have imagined. Outside, the city hummed with life. Neighborhood festivals, community gardens, preserved historic buildings standing proudly alongside thoughtfully designed new spaces. Eleanor's vision had taken root and grown into something extraordinary. A city where progress didn't mean destruction, where wealth was measured in connections, where angels still walked among those who had eyes to see them. Richard closed Eleanor's Bible, feeling its gentle warmth. Inside, generations of wisdom waited to guide future guardians of community and faith. The book had become more than just a family heirloom. It was a beacon of hope, a testament to the power of believing in something greater than oneself. Spring sunlight painted the city in shades of promise, touching each neighborhood that had chosen to preserve its heart and soul. And somewhere, in every community that needed guidance, a small girl with a Bible sat reading, waiting to help others see what truly matters. On a warm evening in late spring, Richard sat in Eleanor's tower room, surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of generations. The walls were now lined with photographs from protected communities across the city, each telling its own story of preservation and renewal. Maps covered his grandmother's old desk, marked with colored pins showing the expanding network of neighborhood guardians. A knock at the door revealed Marcus, carrying a leather-bound journal. "Dad, you need to see this." The Historical Society found it in their archives, Grandma Eleanor's personal diary from 1972. Richard carefully opened the journal, his heart catching at the sight of his grandmother's familiar handwriting. "Today, I met an extraordinary child. She appeared on the church steps, reading a Bible that seemed too large for her small hands. But when she spoke, I heard wisdom beyond any earthly age. She told me that the future would bring great challenges to our communities, but that she would help guide those chosen to protect them. I asked her name, Sarah, she said, but she was more than just a child. In her eyes, I saw the light of divine purpose. Together, we began planning protections that would stretch far beyond my own time, preparing for a day when the very soul of our city would need defending." "She knew," Marcus whispered. "She knew everything that would happen." "Not everything." Sarah's voice came from the doorway. She stood there, timeless as ever, Eleanor now beside her. "She knew what could happen if people chose to see with their hearts. The rest depended on you." Victoria appeared behind them, followed by Rebecca and James. They carried news. The City Council had just passed the Community Heritage Protection Act, enshrining Eleanor's principles into law. Across the city, neighborhoods were discovering their own protective frameworks, their own guardian angels. "But there's more," Rebecca announced excitedly. Other cities are reaching out. They want to implement similar protections. Eleanor's vision is spreading beyond New York. Eleanor stepped forward, her presence filling the room with gentle light. The seeds we planted are becoming forests, she said softly. But remember, legal protections are just the beginning. The true guardianship lies in awakened hearts. Sarah opened her Bible, showing them a new passage. Where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there am I among them. It was never just about buildings or property rights, Richard understood. At last. It was about creating spaces where community could flourish, where people could connect, where love could take root and grow. Through the tower window, they could see the city transformed. The aggressive development that had once threatened to erase neighborhood identities had given way to thoughtful preservation and renewal. Communities that had once faced destruction now thrived, each maintaining its unique character while supporting others. Your work here is nearly complete, Sarah told Richard, but the legacy continues. Others will need guidance, just as you did. Victoria touched Richard's hand. Tell them about the Foundation's new initiative. Richard smiled. We're establishing the Eleanor Sterling Institute for Community Preservation. It will train community leaders from around the country, sharing the principles Eleanor and Sarah taught us. The first class starts next month. Perfect timing, Sarah said, her ageless eyes twinkling. There are more angels waiting to be called, more communities ready to awaken, each in their own time, each in their own way. Eleanor moved to stand by her old desk, touching the maps with tender familiarity. Remember when you thought wealth could only be measured in dollars and cents? She asked Richard. Now look at how rich you've become, in purpose, in love, in the knowledge that what you protect will outlast any tower. The evening light streamed through the window, creating a rainbow bridge between heaven and earth. Along it stood more angels, each carrying their own books of wisdom, each ready to guide another community toward awakening. The work is never truly finished, Sarah said, but neither are we ever truly alone in it. The angels walk wherever. Faith leads them, wherever hearts are ready to see what really matters. Richard looked at his family, his colleagues, the growing movement they had built together. In each face, he saw the light of purpose that had first awakened in him that fateful day on the church steps. Eleanor's vision had become their mission, and their mission was becoming a legacy that would ripple out in ways none of them could fully imagine. The first graduation ceremony of the Eleanor Sterling Institute brought community leaders from across the country to the church where it all began. The pews were filled with people who carried dreams of preservation and renewal for their own neighborhoods. Each graduate had spent months learning not just the legal frameworks Eleanor had created, but the deeper wisdom she had left behind. Richard stood at the podium, Eleanor's Bible beside him, looking out at the faces of future guardians. My grandmother understood something that took me a lifetime to learn, he began. She knew that true wealth isn't found in what we build or own, but in what we protect and nurture. In the front row sat his family, Victoria, Marcus, and now his young granddaughter Eleanor, named for the great-grandmother whose legacy she would one day help carry forward. Behind them were the pioneers of their movement, James, Emily, Rebecca, Linda, and dozens of others who had helped transform Eleanor's vision into reality. Each of you, Richard continued, returns to your communities carrying something precious, not just knowledge, but vision. The ability to see what others might miss, to protect what others might overlook, to value what cannot be measured in monetary terms. Sarah appeared in her usual spot on the steps, but she wasn't alone. Beside each graduate sat another angel, each carrying their own book of wisdom, each ready to guide another community toward awakening. The afternoon light through the stained glass windows created a cathedral of living color, a bridge between heaven and earth. Young Eleanor tugged at Victoria's sleeve, pointing. Look, Grandma, angels everywhere. Victoria smiled, remembering how she had once been blind to such wonders. Now she saw them clearly, the divine presence that walked alongside their human efforts, the sacred purpose in their work of preservation. The graduating class rose to receive their certificates, each one also getting a copy of Eleanor's preserved writings and guidelines. But more than documents, they carried with them a new way of seeing, a new understanding of what community truly meant. You are not just preserving buildings, Sarah's voice rang out clear and true. You are protecting the spaces where love grows, where connections flourish, where souls find sanctuary. Each community you save becomes a light for others, a beacon of hope in a world that too often forgets what truly matters. Eleanor appeared beside her, looking out at the gathering with joy and pride. "The work continues," she said softly. Each generation adding its own wisdom to what came before, each heart opening to the possibility of divine purpose in everyday choices. As if in response, the angels around the room began to glow, their light merging with the rainbow colors from the windows. The graduates watched in wonder as their communities appeared in vision before them, not as they were, but as they could be, transformed by love and protection and purpose. Richard picked up Eleanor's Bible one last time, opening it to a page marked with a pressed flower from the church garden. "My grandmother wrote here that true legacy isn't measured in years or dollars, but in the lives we touch and the love we leave behind. Each of you now carries a piece of that legacy." Sarah stepped forward, her ageless eyes bright with divine light. "The angels will walk with you," she promised the graduates. "We appear wherever faith leads, wherever hearts are ready to see, wherever communities need protection. Look for us in the quiet moments, in the sacred spaces, in the choices that shape not just buildings but souls." Young Eleanor ran up to the podium, reaching for Sarah's hand. The child and the angel smiled at each other with perfect understanding, one representing the future, the other the eternal presence that would help guide it. "The story doesn't end here," Richard concluded, looking out at the graduates, the angels, the gathered community. "It continues in each neighborhood you protect, each connection you nurture, each heart you help awaken to what truly matters." The light in the church seemed to intensify, filling the space with divine radiance. Eleanor and Sarah stood together, one last time, their presence a testament to the eternal partnership between heaven and earth in the work of preserving what is precious. As the ceremony concluded, the graduates filed out into the spring evening, each accompanied by their guardian, angel, each carrying the light of purpose in their hearts. They returned to communities across the country, ready to continue the work Eleanor Sterling had begun, protecting not just places, but the very soul of community itself. Richard watched them go, thinking of that first day when he had met Sarah on these steps. He had thought he was losing everything, only to find what truly mattered. Now that wisdom would spread, touching life after life, community after community, carried forward by those who had learned to see with their hearts. The angels began to fade in the evening light, but their presence lingered in the renewed spirit of purpose that filled the air. Eleanor's last smile to her grandson carried all the pride and love she had always held for him, now fulfilled in ways neither could have imagined. "Remember," Sarah's voice echoed softly as she too began to fade. "Wherever love builds bridges, instead of walls, wherever faith outweighs fear, wherever community matters more than profit, there you will find us, guiding, protecting, believing. For what is planted in divine purpose blooms in eternal light." 1 year after the first institute graduation, Richard found himself back on the church steps, sitting exactly where he had first met Sarah. The neighborhood buzzed with life around him, children playing in the community gardens, elderly residents chatting on benches dedicated to Eleanor's memory, small businesses thriving under the protection of her legacy. "Grandpa," young Eleanor ran up, clutching a familiar leather-bound Bible. "Look what I found in the tower room." Richard recognized it immediately, not his grandmother's Bible, which now traveled with institute graduates around the country, but Sarah's own book, the one she had carried during all her appearances. He had never been able to hold it before. It had always seemed more vision than substance. "Open it," a soft voice said. Sarah sat beside them, looking exactly as she had that first morning. But now Richard saw her clearly, not just a mysterious child, but a bridge between heaven and earth, between past and future. Young Eleanor opened the Bible with reverent care. Inside, written in a script that seemed to shimmer with its own light, were names, thousands of them, filling page after page. Richard recognized some, his own, his family's, community leaders from across the country, but most were unknown to him, stretching back through time and forward into the future. "These are all the people whose hearts have been awakened," Sarah explained. "Every person who has learned to see what truly matters, who has chosen to protect rather than destroy, to build community rather than walls. Your grandmother's name was one of the first." Victoria and Marcus appeared, followed by James, Emily, Rebecca, and Linda. They carried news from protected communities across the country, stories of neighborhoods saved, connections restored, hope renewed. The Eleanor Sterling Community Trust had grown into a national movement, its principles spreading like ripples in an endless pool. "But there's something else you need to see," Sarah said. She turned to the Bible's final pages, which seemed to glow with possibility. They were blank, waiting to be filled. "These are for the stories yet to come, the hearts yet to awaken, the communities yet to be saved." Young Eleanor touched the empty pages with wonder. "Will my name be there someday?" "That depends on the choices you make," Sarah smiled. "Just as it depended on the choices your grandfather made, and his grandmother before him. Each person writes their own story in this book through the lives they touch and the love they share." The afternoon light streamed through the church's stained glass windows, creating that familiar rainbow bridge between heaven and earth. Along it stood countless figures, angels who had guided other communities, other hearts, other transformations. "Look," Richard told his granddaughter, "really look, what do you see?" The child's eyes widened as she truly saw the divine presence that surrounded them. "Angels," she whispered, "everywhere. And they all have books like Sarah's. Because the story is still being written." Eleanor's voice came from behind them. She stood in the rainbow light, looking exactly as she had in life, her own Bible clutched to her chest. In every community that needs protection, in every heart ready to awaken, in every choice between profit and purpose. Richard watched as his granddaughter walked toward Eleanor and Sarah, taking her place in the continuing legacy. The blank pages in Sarah's Bible seemed to shimmer with anticipation, ready to record new stories of transformation and renewal. "The work goes on," Sarah said softly. "In ways we can see and ways we can't, in hearts awakened and communities saved, in choices made and love shared. Each person who learns to see becomes a light for others, just as you became a light, Richard." The angels began to fade in the evening light, but their presence lingered in the renewed spirit of purpose that filled the air. Young Eleanor returned to her grandfather's side, carrying both Sarah's Bible and the wisdom it represented. "What do we do now?" she asked. Richard looked out at the community his grandmother had protected, that he had learned to save, that future generations would continue to preserve. "We keep watching," he said. "We keep believing. We keep protecting what matters most. Because somewhere, right now, another heart is ready to awaken, another community needs saving, another story is waiting to be written." The sun set over the city, painting the sky in colors that matched the church's stained glass. In its light, the blank pages of Sarah's Bible seemed to pulse with promise, waiting for new names, new stories, new transformations yet to come. The story of Richard Sterling's transformation spread far beyond New York City, touching hearts and awakening spirits across the country. But perhaps its greatest impact was on those who witnessed it firsthand, the communities saved, the lives changed, the souls awakened to what truly matters. In Brooklyn Heights, a developer walked away from a luxury project after seeing Sarah reading on the steps of a historic church. In Queens, a neighborhood found Eleanor's protective frameworks, hidden in property deeds, just hours before demolition was scheduled to begin. In communities across the city, angels appeared carrying books of wisdom, guiding those ready to see toward a deeper understanding of true wealth. The Eleanor Sterling Institute continued to grow, each graduating class carrying her vision to new communities. Richard watched as the movement his grandmother had begun rippled outward in ever-widening circles of hope and renewal. Young Eleanor, now a regular presence in the tower room, spent hours studying both Sarah's Bible and her great-grandmother's writings. She saw what others often missed, the angels that walked among them, the divine purpose in their work, the eternal significance of choosing community over profit. "The stories never really end," she told her grandfather one evening as they sat in the church garden. "They just become part of something bigger." Richard nodded, understanding at last the full scope of what his grandmother and Sarah had set in motion. Every awakened heart became a light for others, every protected community a beacon of hope, every choice to preserve rather than destroy a thread in an eternal tapestry. The sun set over the city skyline, now a harmonious blend of preserved heritage and thoughtful development. In its light, Richard could see angels walking among the crowds, some carrying books like Sarah's, others simply watching over the communities they had helped protect. Sarah appeared one final time, Eleanor beside, her both smiling with divine joy. "Your story has touched many hearts," Sarah said, "but it's only one of countless stories being written in communities across the world. Each person who learns to see with their heart adds their own chapter to this eternal book." She held out her Bible, its pages now filled with new names, new transformations, new awakenings. "The final pages remain blank," she said, "waiting for those who will come after, those who will continue the work of protecting what truly matters." Young Eleanor stepped forward, accepting both the responsibility and the blessing that came with it. "We'll keep watching," she promised. "We'll keep believing, we'll keep telling the story." "Yes," Sarah smiled, her presence beginning to fade into the evening light. "Because somewhere, right now, someone is ready to awaken to what truly matters. Someone is ready to see with their heart instead of their eyes. Someone is ready to choose love over profit, community over power, eternal purpose over temporary gain." Eleanor hugged her grandson one last time. "The greatest wealth," she whispered, "is the love we leave behind." As the angels faded into the gathering dusk, their light seemed to spread across the city, touching every community that had been saved, every heart that had been awakened, every soul that had learned to see what truly matters.